Latest industry to take a supply chain hit, and that's farming. With a global fertilizer shortage, farmers across the world are having to shift tactics to make sure they have a good crop to harvest and
Those Trump tariffs could have damaged agriculture substantially, not just exported grain and ethanol, but imported fertilizer.
Trump is proposing what he calls severe tariffs on Canadian fertilizers. His idea here is apparently to support domestic production.
The United States imposed a 25% tariff on Canadian grain and grain products in early February 2025. The tariff threatens a vital trade relationship worth over $17 billion annually. According to Grain Growers of Canada, the tariff functions as a direct tax on American families who purchase everyday food staples at grocery stores. Kyle Larkin, Executive Director of Grain Growers of Canada, stated that the tariff is not just a burden on Canadian farmers, but a tax on every American family purchasing bread and oatmeal and canola oil and other food staples. A 25% tariff is in effect a 25% tax on American consumers. Larkin said in February 2025, the United States imports over $17 billion worth of Canadian grain and grain products every year to meet domestic demand. These imports include wheat for bread and durum wheat for pasta, and oats for food products, and canola for oil and biofuels, and barley for feed and brewing, and other grain products for widespread usage. As of 2023, Canadian wheat exports to the US totaled over $1 billion. Oats reached $580 million. Barley accounted for over $200 million. Canola exports, which are needed for cooking oil and biofuels, were valued at $8.5 billion. Dean Dias, Chief Executive Officer of Cereals Canada, warned in February 2025 that the implementation of significant tariffs on Canadian cereal grains and ingredients will drastically impact their availability in North America. This leads to increased costs for food processors and lower returns for farmers and higher grocery bills for American families. Cereals Canada raised alarms about the severe economic impact the tariffs will have on the Canadian agriculture sector and the national economy. The United States is Canada's 6th largest market for non-durum wheat and 4th largest market for durum wheat and 2nd largest market for barley and largest market for oats. Dias emphasized that Canadian ingredients are an integral part of US food processing. The US currently depends on Canada for over half of its durum wheat use and over half of its oats use. These tariffs will ultimately be passed on to American consumers, he stated. Tara Sawyer, chair of Grain Growers of Canada and an Alberta grain farmer, said in February 2025 that reckless tariffs will only lead to costly consequences. This is true for Canadian grain farmers, but also American producers who rely on Canadian potash to fertilize their farms. Whether you are growing crops or buying groceries, these tariffs will make life more expensive at a time when most are already being priced out, Sawyer stated. The tariffs are expected to drive up prices for a range of everyday products. These include bread and pasta and beer and oatmeal and canola oil, which will worsen the current affordability crisis for both American and Canadian consumers. Beyond food prices, the tariffs threaten the broader US agricultural economy. Canadian grain imports allow American farmers to focus on high-value exports, securing better returns for their crops and strengthening North America's position as a global agricultural powerhouse. Canada exports more than 70% of its grain production globally and relies heavily on international markets. The tariffs are expected to drive down farm gate prices for key crops such as wheat and canola and oats and barley and pulses. This makes it increasingly difficult for farmers to remain financially viable. Larkin stated in March 2025 that tariffs of this magnitude will put family-run grain farms at risk by introducing widespread market uncertainty. Sawyer noted that as price takers, grain farmers are at the whim of the global markets that Canada exports to. Margins are already razor thin, and an added financial burden like this could put the future of many family farms in jeopardy, she said. Canada and the US have benefited from reliable two-way trade with Canada, exporting cereals to the US and importing consumer products vital to Canadian farmers, including input supplies and machinery. The disruption stands to jeopardize Canada's export position and farmers' incomes, but also the relationship between Canada and the US. Cereals Canada warned in February 2025 that the tariffs will sever cross-border supply chains and damage the long-standing relationship between the two countries. In 2024, Canada exported a total of 4.5 million tons of wheat and durum wheat and oats and barley and rye and flaxseed and canola to the United States, according to Statistics Canada. Industry contacts stated in February 2025 that most Canadian exporters are opting not to sell to the United States on new business due to current market uncertainty and potential tariffs. Uncertainty around tariffs is prompting Canadian grain handlers to diversify markets for exports of crops not already booked. The imposition of Canadian and US tariffs on key agricultural commodities has added new layers of uncertainty to Canadian wheat exports, particularly in terms of competitiveness and market access. These trade tensions have pressured Canadian exporters to seek alternative markets and maintain competitive pricing amid rising logistical and compliance costs. On March 4, 2025, Canada implemented a 25% tariff on an initial tranche of over $20 billion in imports of goods from the United States, including $5.5 billion in agricultural products, according to USDA Foreign Agricultural Service. The list of products was expected to expand on March 25, 2025, to cover a second tranche of an additional $86 billion worth of imports. The tariffs are part of broader trade tensions between the United States and Canada. From Inauguration Day through March 18, 2025, an additional 20% of tariffs were applied to all Chinese products and 25% to most Canadian and Mexican products, according to the American Farm Bureau Federation. These tariffs on USMCA-compliant products were subsequently paused through April 2, 2025. The imposition of tariffs and subsequent retaliatory measures by other governments is occurring rapidly. Grain Growers of Canada called on the Canadian government to take action to eliminate the recently imposed tariffs. The organization emphasized that the importation of $17 billion worth of Canadian grain and grain products supports the United States in being able to meet its own domestic food security needs. It also supports the U.S. agri-food sector in exporting products internationally for the best price possible. The 25% tariff on Canadian grain fundamentally operates as a tax on American consumers who shop for groceries. American food processors now face increased costs. Canadian farmers confront market uncertainty and declining farm gate prices. The long-standing trade relationship between the two countries faces unprecedented strain. American families will ultimately bear the cost through higher prices for bread and pasta and cereal and beer and cooking oil.